Hi everybody, thank you all for coming today. Thank you all for including me again in the home and school general meetings to be able to discuss what I really find to be a fascinating topic. Whether you've read the book Quiet or not, today I think is going to be a really interesting discussion. And I think really eye-opening about yourself, your partners, your families, your children. So the way I imagine today going is I certainly don't want this to be a lecture. I would like this to be very interactive. At any point, please raise your hand and comment, question at any point. The second part of today's talk is going to really focus on what parents can do and what educators can do to really support not only our introverted students and children, but also really work to change the culture in schools and communities. So I'm really hoping that we'll be able to hear a lot in the second half from parents and from teachers. What I do want to do for this first section, though, is be able to give you all some key points from Susan Cain's research and a few points that I've researched that tie into her book. She is so well researched that her points really don't need to be elaborated more by me, but I have a few examples that will tie in. So I really want to give you guys a framework for that. I actually had the opportunity to see Susan speak at the Sundance Authors Series in December, and she is just as magnificent in person as she is in writing, and I actually had the chance to speak with her about specifically the issue of introverts in education. So I will be able to summarize what she said when we get to that section. She was really wonderful. So what I'm going to do first is start with talking a little bit about the terms we're addressing today. I think that the word introvert and introversion has been misunderstood in the literature and really colloquially as well. And so I want to talk to you about the way that Susan Cain defines these traits so that we can really have a fuller understanding. Extroverts, as we experience them, as they experience themselves, really get recharged. The way that they refuel their tank is through social interaction and making sense of the sensory world, really plunging in and being part of it. Introverts, on the other hand, while they can do very well socially and really enjoy their time in the world, the way that they refuel themselves, recharge their battery, is through solitude, through quiet solo pursuits. So both can look comfortable socially, but one may then need to really spend some time recharging alone. Ambiverts, that's a new term that appears in the literature now, really within the last 5 years. Those are the people that can actually pretty successfully navigate both the introverted world and the extroverted world. So in many ways they kind of have the best of both worlds, though they can go too far into one side or the other inadvertently. Shyness is often confused for introversion, but it's very different. Shyness is that feeling that can be actually very painful for people experiencing it, is kind of a feeling of awkwardness and being socially judged. It's a tremendously anxiety-provoking feeling, and really is not at all related to the experience of a healthy introvert. But many times in our culture, we tend to lump them together, and of course shyness has become a very nauseous, looked upon as a very negative trait, and yet many introverts are called that. I had an interesting discussion with Jennifer about that, of how disappointing it can feel when you have a child that's choosing not to talk and somebody labels them as shy, when in fact they may just be self-protecting and not wishing to share their thoughts at the time. Sensitivity is a trait. High sensitivity has really been discussed in the literature through a wonderful book, The Highly Sensitive Person by Elaine Aron. She also has a book, The Highly Sensitive Child, that talks about this trait that can be experienced by both introverts and extroverts, but it's really an overstimulation in high sensory or high environments. So a highly sensitive person can become flooded in for example, in a social situation when they can read, for example, the sad mood or a tension with somebody else in the room. They'll really feel that acutely. They also tend to be physically sensitive to their environment in that a siren, for example, can generate a high cortisol, high adrenaline response, which can take several minutes often to come down from, whereas a low sensitivity person may not be so attuned to those and therefore not as flooded by them. So both introverts and extroverts can be sensitive. It is probably more closely associated, however, with introverts, given their tendency to really read and contemplate and interpret stimuli in the world rather than introverts who jump right in. So those are kind of some terms that we're going to be throwing around today in our discussion. So what distinguishes an introvert? There are really some key words. Of course, I've put those in italics. But these are some of the defining characteristics. Effective listening. Does their best work really alone and when they're centered with their own thinking pattern. Very contemplative. Very much enjoying a small gathering over a large one, or in a large party where they may enjoy their time. They're probably going to enjoy it most talking to one person or two people in a corner for 45 minutes as opposed to working the room, which is going to really recharge an extrovert. Of course, we have a very famous introvert pictured, Abraham Lincoln, who is widely thought to be the most historically notable introvert, and had some astonishing qualities that are not so represented in perhaps our political leadership now. More on that soon. So the neurobiology, I'm not going to focus too much on neuroscience here, but it is an interesting area to take a peek at. In 1999, a series of scientists looked at the brains of some very defined introverts versus extroverts. And what they found was that the blood flow in the brain blood flow of extroverts really focused on the frontal lobe, the blood flow of introverts focused on the frontal lobe, which is largely thought to be associated with executive function as well as problem solving. So you really see an intense focus on looking intuitively and inwardly. And then for the extroverts, you notice blood flow in parts of the brain that focus very significantly on sensory stimulation. Areas of the world that fascinate them. They'll look at a picture and you'll see that their sensory experience is on fire. They're really recharged by that, whereas you see the brain of an introvert going inward and really contemplating. So we know from that there really is a difference in the way that introverts and extroverts perceive the world, and their experience is really different from a biological standpoint. So introverts, I love that phrase because can't you relate to several people that are just relieved. It says, for those in the back, it says, phew, that was close, I almost had to socialize. Which of course is an over-exaggeration, but many introverts are relieved when they don't have to do that anymore than they need to. So introverts focus on the meaning they make of events swirling around them, while extroverts just plunge right into the event themselves. Okay, so who are they? Let's give a face to these so-called introverts. Here pictured we have, of course, J.K. Rowling, the very famous author of the Harry Potter series, who of note spent over 5 years in rural England researching Harry Potter meticulously long before she put pen to paper, a quality we see in a lot of introverts, taking much more time with the issues in which they are passionate about. And of course, once the book went to print and became a sensation, she was immediately terrified of what followed, which was the press, the book tours, etc. Albert Einstein, who very famously quoted, I love this one, it says, "It's not that I'm so smart, it's that I stay with problems longer." And indeed he did, gratefully so, for all of us. We have down at the bottom, for those that may not recognize that photo, that is Rosa Parks, shortly after she was arrested in the Montgomery bus boycott, who, of course, from that moment forward, the groundswell began for the civil rights movement, and many could argue that, in fact, she was the initial architect of that movement. Here we have Warren Buffett, the quiet but powerful CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, who in the book very famously, there's a chapter about him where he very famously predicted in 2007 at a hedge fund conference what was to come if the financial institutions did not change their practices and exercise more caution. He was written off to be rather a dinosaur, and new money, new tech hedge fund managers largely disregarded his discussion, which of course we all know what happened in 2008, where his predictions certainly panned out to be true, and many of those hedge fund companies did not return for future meetings as they went under. Well, Berkshire Hathaway remained very much intact. So we look at these faces, and then this is going to be, just notice they all have a look of strength, right? Strength, fortitude, but a different type of strength perhaps than these photos. Okay? So the extroverts really, I mean, we can just tell instantly. They look like they're just going to come out of this screen and, you know, to music and lighting and fireworks, you know, from their expressions themselves. Very powerful also, of course, we have Oprah Winfrey, needs no introduction, Bill Clinton, the Martin Luther King Jr., very important figure this month, and as all months, and Sheryl Sandberg, the CFO of Facebook. So all of these people really use their voice, they use their external power, they use themselves really they plunge into every event that they participate in such a way that you can feel the reverberations of who they are. And that is important, but not more important than their introverted counterparts. The problem we have is a lack of balance. I'm going to get into that here in just a moment. But let's look at what balance looks like next. So when introverts and extroverts are combined successful, we have an incredible duality that takes place. Here at the top we have, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, who is the CEO of Facebook, who is, you know, by all accounts a tech genius, but certainly not comfortable to be the face of Facebook and to do the press that is required to be the public face of that enterprise, which is where Sheryl Sandberg comes in. She's of course made her own mark in the becoming a lightning rod for the role of women in today's society with her book Lean In. So separate from that, she has really plunged deeply into her passions, but together they're a really effective balance. And they've talked about that in many press conferences, that they work so well together because she can really publicly promote the message of Facebook while he can focus on what he does best, which is developing from the tech side that company more deeply. Here we have FDR with Eleanor Roosevelt. FDR was a remarkable leader by all accounts, but a very private one. So private, in fact, that of course nobody knew of his physical disability until long after he exited office. So he worked very well from his office, developing policy and thinking critically, but it was his wife, Eleanor, that really cemented his policy into action on the ground. She really defined the role of first spouse, so to speak, by by really getting out and championing causes and integrating herself with the constituency, which had never been done before by any certainly by any political spouse. Here we have Rosa Parks with Martin Luther King Jr. That duality we know has certainly defined my generation, if not all of ours. And it was really that quiet power of Rosa Parks doing what she did in her own fashion, quietly starting this revolution, which allowed for Martin Luther King really to exercise his voice in such a powerful broad way. And together, he's disclosed many times over again that he could not have done what he did without Rosa Parks. Here we have Bill and Melinda Gates. They have a really excellent TED Talk, if you ever get the chance to see it, talking about the way that they run the Gates Foundation. Since Bill Gates has retired from Microsoft, he is full-time with Melinda at their philanthropic foundation, the largest in the world. And much like Mark Zuckerberg, he much prefers to delve into the research, statistics, the math that's involved with giving away billions of dollars. Whereas Melinda prefers to be out in the field visiting her grantees and people, in rural areas, Africa, and the schools in the U.S. And so they have a great moment in their TED Talk where they talk about, he comes back with the numbers and says, listen, this mosquito netting, this is going to work, perfect in Zambia because of, this. I've run the numbers. And she says, but no, it's not, because I've talked to the women there, and this is their issue, on the ground with this mosquito netting, and this is why it isn't going to work. And so had she not been out in the field and had he not been crunching the numbers, their solutions would be far less effective. So, very powerful when both can be combined. Briefly, before we go into when the balance tips towards extroversion, it's important to mention that we have a real cultural difference in introversion versus extroversion in the United States, in that because that we overvalue the extrovert ideal here in the US, and it is actually honored and supported the introvert ideal elsewhere, we have a real issue in this country with those who come from a cultural background where a more contemplative introverted stance is actually very effective, respected, and more commonly utilized in business and school. This is a photo that I found from, apparently in India, they've also started The Apprentice, the reality show, The Apprentice in India, and they've tapped talent from a number of Eastern nations, and if you look at them, you see powerful, perhaps more reserved, contestants ready to participate in the show. I would love to actually see that show to see if it looks very different from perhaps the American version. This is actually a promotion, a promo photograph from a business in the US looking to hire new recruits. And of course, this is the message they're sending. We are gonna just rock this place. This is, this is your best job ever, right? And yet, is that what works for everybody? Is that the right model for the company itself? So we have, there's some really formidable challenges that people face, not just from the eastern part of the world, but also, you have really an introverted culture going on in Northern Europe as well. There's many pockets throughout the world where introversion is valued, and yet when they gravitate towards the US, which many do for many reasons, school, business, otherwise, they find themselves really challenged to find advancement and opportunity, because it appears that to do so they will have to change really who they are in order to be successful. And that is a real problem, given that we want this country to continue to be a place where we can harness various cultures in schools and offices. Okay, so when the balance tips too far towards extroversion, we have some significant problems. There's two bastions of power where extroversion is the predominant personality trait represented. Those, of course, are in the business finance world and in politics. Okay, we have just a couple examples recently where those two institutions haven't exactly made the best decisions. On Wall Street, of course, you have this risk-taking, gregarious personality, which has defined our financial institutions for years, have led to some very, very poor decisions. And perhaps I wonder what it would have been like if there were more Warren Buffetts per se, or those that have the more quiet, contemplative stance in finance who also had a voice, if we wouldn't have quite so many problems in that industry right now. Regardless of where you are, on which aisle you stand, Congress is remarkably gridlocked, and we have a lot of loud voices there. And on either side, it appears there's a lack of listening, pausing, and compromise, which introverts are known to be very good at. Using their softer power and reflecting more on issues tends to be very effective in decision making, which is what Congress is designed to do. And yet with this many large egos also, but also large gregarious personalities, I think that we're having a difficult time in this country reaching effective decisions. And I wonder if there could be quieter, more powerful leaders, FDRs, for example, in our decision-making elected positions, whether we would have so much gridlock. Something to think about. So how did we get to this place? Because we weren't always here in the United States. There was a time when the extrovert ideal was not the predominant way to look at the world. And in fact, it began really when with the Industrial Revolution, where we had, for the first time, people moving out of small communities where they knew everybody and had to find a way to work effectively in small groups, because that was how you ran a farm and farming community. When the Industrial Revolution arrived and people began to move to the cities, for the first time you have people interacting with total strangers. And many were struggling and ill-prepared to do that. Dale Carnegie was one of them, an Iowa farmhand who was captivated by the idea that the Industrial Revolution could make him very successful, but could not seem to advance in the big city. So he ended up writing, learning how to become a more personable, affable, bubbly person, and then wrote the book, How to Win Friends and Influence People, which still to this day is the best-selling self-help book of all time. And the message really, when you read it, which I did, is you must change and be radiant, be glowing, be bubbly, is really the crux of that book. And if you do, success will follow. So we have this new idea, a radiant personality for every child. This becomes the slogan. And the culture of personality now replaces this culture of character, which when you look at books written prior to Dale Carnegie's book, you see books on Abraham Lincoln that talk about his, for example, his strength of character and the deep thought, quiet thought that he would go in before approaching any decision. And this was actually a very respected quality. But this changed, and of course there was something to be said for learning the skills to interact with strangers in a community. That was necessary, but we may have just overcorrected a tad, and that's what Susan Cain argues. So what she posits in the book is that we have gone too far in the reverse, and we need to come back to the center. She talks a lot about a phrase that never used to exist that has existed in the last several years, which is this idea that we all need to come out of our shell. That in fact, having some sort of protective way that we approach the world is ineffective and wrong. And I can remember as a child hearing that expression a lot with other children, oh, Allison, I just can't wait for her to come out of her shell. She'll be, as if to say, Allison as she is, certainly not a radiant personality as we're supposed to have, but she'll get there. And this idea that that is a problem, and that we shouldn't, for example, naturally carry some sort of shelter or protection around us, that's in some way wrong, is really contrary, of course, to biology itself, but also a fairly nauseous expression, as Susan Cain asserts. Okay, so this is where really the meat of this is going to come in, and I hope that we can talk more about this. How has the extrovert ideal affected education? Well, it has in a lot of ways. None of these issues, group projects, pods, classroom discussion, none of these points that I bring up are problematic in and of themselves. The problem only becomes if they are the only way in which students are permitted to learn or be graded in school. So a pod really is a great way for children to learn. Maybe not in every subject. Is math, is creative writing, sort of these solo pursuits, in fact, where it requires a lot of deep internal thinking. Is a pod perhaps the best way to do those projects? Maybe not. I think here in Rowland Hall, and we'll hear a little bit more, there is an opportunity for students to do independent work in other places, but I have one child who's in the public school system, and I can tell you that that's not the case. And with the Common Core curriculum that's in place really nationwide and here in the state, we have a real significant valuation on every work being group work, on all projects being done, at your desk collaboratively. And I actually had my daughter tell me the other day, it's really hard to work when Alejandro's just, like twiddling his pencil around and I can see him, and you think that's true. If you're looking at someone all day long, it could be very distracting to your independent process. Discussion, really in many cases, and particularly at the college level, counts for a really large part of your grade when you get into senior seminars and your higher level classes. And that can be a real challenge for those who are introverted, who often don't want to speak until they have formed their entire thought completely, whereas extroverts prefer to get to their point while they're talking, And so this is, right? And this is a challenge because the introverts can't keep up. Even if they have something insightful to say, they usually can't keep up, and by the time they have that thought fully formed, there's been 10 extroverted hands raised and the conversation has gone from here to here, and so they can't demonstrate their process and the way in which they've come to it, which is a challenge and a problem. We'll talk more about that in one second, but before we do that, I want to just also say how it's affected the business world as well. In the 90s, really, the open plan offices became the only way to have an office, and the idea is that there's just going to be this free flow of creativity at all times. Everyone's just going to work together and pop over to someone's desk, which is right there, and there's no wall, so it's going to be really easy to have a discussion. And of course, that not only did it not work for introverts, it actually didn't really work well for extroverts either, who became, highly distracted and really engaged in discussions and creative processes that really didn't lead anywhere. So we're finding more and more that walls are being put up in the very famous, Google compound in Northern California, which was wide open when it's first built. If you look at pictures now, you see them constructing walls everywhere. So it's not there. I think people are finding that doesn't work. Okay, so how can we help? Well, in a lot of ways, and I think that this is a great quote. I'm going to read out loud for those in the back. It says, "We know from myths and fairy tales that there are many different kinds of power in this world. One child is given a lightsaber, another a wizard's education. The trick is not to amass all different kinds of power, but to use well the kind you've been granted." So in fact, the message needs to be to our introverted children and colleagues, no, don't change. What you have is inherently valuable. Need to figure out an effective way for you to use that power, but the idea is not for you to become someone different or to create a power that is not intuitive to you, but use the one you have. And so we need to figure out how to do that, and hoping with discussion we can look at some different ideas. So I'd love to hear from some of our educators here about what they do. I think there's some really creative ways that Rowland Hall is addressing the needs of introverts and also creating balance in the classroom. These were a few that Susan Cain suggested, where after you ask the class a question, pause at least 7 seconds, perhaps even longer, because the introvert does need that time again to formulate the thought. And if you wait before you call on anyone, there's a chance that you will very likely get the introvert's point of view as well. Ensuring that individual roles within a group project are clearly defined. It's fine to have group projects, but it's important that the individual roles are clearly noted, so that the introvert who may be participating and feel somewhat uncomfortable with so many people has a clear idea of what his role will be. Of course, small discussion works much better for an introvert than large discussion. It allows them to actually have a voice, whereas in an entire classroom it becomes more overwhelming. And again, the idea of private workspace could sometimes, your young child working in a pod, could they have the option, could there be times in the day where they could sit in a quiet corner and do their work, and can the educator support that for that child? And I'd love to hear more from Tyler and Lee, Ryan, Jennifer.
Go now?
What's that?
Everybody just take over now?
Yeah, I'd love to hear.
So I will use my voice a little bit, and then I'm going to turn over to Lee and Tyler and Jennifer. But when I first became a teacher, there was such a stress. My mentor teachers and other people said, make sure everybody participates in class. Make sure there's a grade for participation. If anybody doesn't participate, make sure they do participate. Go out of your way. I look back on that now and where we are now and see how wrong that was. But it took me a while to realize that wasn't working for everybody. And I fortunately stumbled into what many of our teachers have not stumbled into, but figured out, was that one year I had the student that was just so quiet, but never got less than a 95 on any test or quiz I gave. She clearly knew all the material, but she just couldn't speak in class. And we had this, part of the grade that had to be class participation. I said, this seems so unfair. So I brought her into my office and I said, you really are struggling speaking in class. What if I gave you the question the night before? That if you raise your hand for this question, I promise I'll ask you. And the next day she came in and I asked the question, she raised her hand, she answered it. And so from then on, I gave her at least one question every night before the class the next day. Now, in retrospect, it's stupid I didn't do this for everybody, because you don't know who all the introverts are. But I did this for a while, and over a while she said, you don't have to do this every day, and eventually over about 2 months' time, I'll give her some questions here and there. But what I realized was, what are the other kids in the class that might need this? So rather than stop giving her the questions, I gave the whole class 2 or 3 questions the night before, and when I discovered that some of the other quiet kids started speaking more because they had time to reflect. And so I stumbled into that, but many of our teachers here have not stumbled into it, but read Susan's book, doing other things. And I'd love to have the principals and Jennifer give some examples of some of the neat things Fiona and some other teachers are doing. So, Lee, you want to start?
Sure. I was just jotting down ideas and notes here. Just some of the techniques that you would see if you're walking around. For example, in addition to asking a question ahead of time, one of the sort of jargony things is something called think, pair, share. So you might ask a question of the class, and then you say, okay, jot down some notes, process for a minute, and then just talk to the person next to you. So you get to begin to think out loud and process what your answer is going to be. So if you're getting to your answer while talking, you get to work that out before you share it with the larger group. And if you're not entirely comfortable, or if you are more of an introvert, you can test that out in a smaller audience before moving on. Similarly, in say an English class, you might be having a class discussion, but what I used to do in a class was I'd say, all right, at the end of each week, every student's going to turn in 2 journal entries on anything that we've discussed this week. And what I would find is that the kids who very rarely wanted to talk without thinking, once you said, well, did anybody have something interesting from their journal? I distinctly remember this girl in my 10th grade English class who spoke up for one of the first times, and literally her classmates were just went, why don't you talk more? You know, because that was such a great idea, but it was because she had the opportunity to work through everything ahead of time that she could present that. So some ways you might see that around here. Fiona Halloran did a presentation for faculty. We have these once a month meetings where just sort of good practices, things that we've observed or that Wendell Thomas, our DCI, has observed, he asks people to share with colleagues. So she shared the idea of the silent debate. And if you think about it, the debate would be the most terrifying thing for an introvert. Talk about being sapped of your energy. Whereas we have an amazing debate program full of extroverts who are, out there talking as fast as they can. But so these were done in pairs, and basically you had to write the debate with a partner. So you take the pro, you make your point, you write it out, hand it over to the person writes it back. And so literally what we think of as this very verbal process of debate was entirely internal and on paper. So that gives an opportunity to be embracing all those skills that you see in a debate, but done in a very quiet way. I think one of the neat things we've done this year with Project 11, which for those of you that Beyond the Classroom program, the 11th grade does a year of civic engagement or community engagement. And we've kind of shifted the goal of it a little bit this year under Sophia Gorder and Mark Ofterdahl's leadership, so that while before it was really more of a kind of a traditional community service kind of activity where you would go and volunteer for a nonprofit or some sort of group in the community, this year they scaffolded it so that you can do that kind of work. You could be pursuing an art project. We've got a group project that's working on clean air. But we also have people who have decided that they're going to do research about a problem and do a whole bunch of individual kind of pursuit of that solution, and maybe build a website, maybe write a paper, propose some solutions, so that you've got entirely flexible ways of going about that community engagement piece. Some people are involved in an art project, for example, something very public, very out there, something very quiet. So those are just a couple of small examples of where you might see it around here.
I'm Tyler, Fallen Road Middle School principal, and I'm going to put Katie on the spot a little bit. We've talked a lot about introverts, but as you said, it's a continuum, a spectrum. A, where are you on that continuum? And B, how do you feel when you're presenting to this large group?
Okay, I will take it. Al and I both took, there is a test that you can take. And Al and I both scored it, and we both scored as ambiverts, right? We were in the middle. So I'm in the category of when I'm passionate about a topic and really interested, I can find my voice and really, really enjoy that. I will, after this, need to be very quiet for several hours, alone with my coffee, probably in my office doing nothing related to talking. So that, I think, is and Alan actually discussed that as well, that he kind of operates that same way, passionate about his work and his education pursuits, and yet needing that recharge. Tyler, would you qualify as a extrovert?
Well, it's interesting. This was not a plan. Now it's my turn.
Right.
You would think I'm very comfortable. I'm compensating for the uncomfortableness sometimes about being put on the spot. I think that, yeah, a lot of people assume I am, and I do too need recharging at the end of the day. And my wife, who's a CFO and sits and doesn't have dialogue all day long, wants to talk at the end of the day, and I'm just done. And no, I don't want to talk about my day, but thank you very much. So it's always a little, but my point about bringing my wife up is that I would, you don't want to put yourself too much in a bubble because you do need to stretch and grow for what I think, if I can edit this, how can educators help introverts and extroverts? Because we all need to figure out what the other person's like and think a little bit more about that person. And I think as I've matured, my extroversion is sliding towards the ambi scale, because I do like to veg out and play solitaire for an hour just when I get the opportunity. So, and I need that alone time to recharge. But as far as the middle school, which can be a very extrovertedly centered place because of the movement and impulse control that developmentally appropriately happens in the middle school, it can be terrifying for those who lean more to the introversion side of the scale. Some of these things are in practice. Some of these things have been being done long before Susan Cain wrote this book because introverted teachers understood that. There is also a misunderstanding that you must be an introvert to teach because you stand and talk at children all day. But sometimes that is not what they, I know that's not great teaching to stand and talk at kids all day. And also knowing sometimes those teachers at 4 o'clock need to just go be in the dark for 4 hours or whatever it is to refuel themselves. Some of the strategies that middle school teachers have worked on, I love this piece here, accommodate private space within the classroom. In our generation, that would have looked like the dunce in the corner with the dunce cap. Now it's a safe haven for a more introverted type of student. I know Charlotte Larson in the 6th grade math has got these 2 little skinny IKEA tables that they look like sofa tables. And if you walked in there, you're like, oh, is that where you go when you're in trouble? Like, no, that's where they go to catch their breath. Because they just don't want to be in that pod any longer. Because I'm tired of Alejandro spinning that pencil, and I just need to take and catch my breath. You'll also see some couches in rooms, and it's like, man, is this a college dorm or is this a classroom? It's like, well, these are little nests, these pods where people can do isolated work. Some teachers should go work in the hallway. You're not in trouble. You need to have a more quiet space. So those are some of the strategies that a lot of teachers are using. One thing that I'm really excited about that has been evolving this year in the 6th grade and the 7th grade is looking at as well is how many 6th grade parents here today? So if you look on their Veracross, you'll have this 18 font letter grade, but if you actually read below the lines, screaming at you extroverted style, but that's how Veracross puts it. But if you look at more detail, the detail report, it shows 3 categories. It says academic mastery, contributions, and participation. And going back to, productivity, P, I don't want to get confused with participation. P is productivity. Those are actually 3 things that we've taken from the mission statement. Academic mastery, academic excellence, productivity, lead ethical and productive lives. And instead of ethics, we put contributions. How do we give to others is how we were interpreting ethics. And you talked about Alan's example of how do you get the introvert to participate in class. Well, we all think participation is the loudest and they're speaking out. But we're recognizing that along the introversion-extroversion scale, there are so many ways to contribute and give to the class that doesn't mean that you're the loudest or the first to raise their hands. And so teachers have been able to assess and give feedback to students on their contributions and let some of the more introverted students feel good about the way they're participating, because it doesn't have to be the loudest one in the room.
What are some of those introverted contributions? How do they, what's an example of that?
Introverted contributions would be coming to the teacher and sharing an idea, doing a contribution in a smaller group rather than a group in a larger share, helping another student one-on-one who might be already moving along and becomes that student coach for that problem without having to be the large class group discussion. Like Alan had said, that was a strategy he used to give the student the question the night before so she could be ready and do that, which is, again, a great tactic that teachers will use, as Alan said, with every student. So some of those things are also possible. So what was it? So the contributions piece on that.
While you're thinking, let me just say, since I've rested a bit, I've had a great opportunity in the last 3 weeks. I visited 20 classes in the middle and upper school, and the teachers had come when I was there, and I was so impressed with how I saw the teachers dealing with this issue. They're doing all those things, and it's once more than 7 seconds to make time. And what they recognize is that the old participation, which can be just empowering and moving the class forward can be done in so many ways. Teachers waited. Teachers would say, "I'm looking for an example of this. You have your homework last night. We'd like you all to look over and see if you have an example that you'd like to share with us." And you can share with either by going up to the board, or they all have the iPad. You can take your iPad and put it up on the Apple TV, which means they don't have to go up and talk about it. They can have it on their own. Or you can share it with your neighbor. So I take you a minute in which you try to find your best example of this in your writing to share. And I thought, wow, this teacher's just given 4 ways in which the kids can do this. And she's not saying, okay, now come up and do it. She said, think about which way you'd like to do it. And in 30 seconds, I'm going to ask for then volunteers to do this. And the kids know over time, she wanted them all to participate. And during the class I was there, every student participated in some way. But it wasn't all standing up in front of the class. I was just so impressed. That kind of thing went from class to class as I went on, where the teachers were finding different ways for the kids to basically have an authentic assessment of were they knowing the material and could they help other kids learn the material. That's what I like so much. Do you have an example that you think would help someone else see why this is a clause or why this is a run-on sentence? And the kids were willing to put their mistakes out. Hey, I think that's a really good example of a mistake here. And I said, this is great. These kids are not saying, this was my mistake. Or the kid that was more quiet might say, this is my mistake, and it'll be up on the Apple TV. And they never had to stand up. So those are some examples.
So yeah, I remember. The other thing why I mentioned how can educators help extroverts as well, what's nice about that contributions piece is a student may actually get a lower grade for contributing too much if they're stealing the show but I'm helping like no, you're taking away from the class environment, you're not contributing to the class environment, and so that they can learn at an early age that how to be thoughtful and be a good listener as well as contributing in the way they think society wants them to, because the teacher's saying this is how we can be successful in high school. I mean, our mission statement talks about a college prep school, middle school is a high school prep. Like if you can learn these 3 components of your learning in classroom involvement, then you can be more successful in high school. So we're looking at that. So
That's great.
yeah.
These examples have been great. I don't want to take any more time. You guys have done
No,
it.
Can I actually ask
Yeah. And I was this segues into something interesting too.
Okay,
Please
this
do,
is
jump in.
A question for Jennifer and Lee and possibly Ryan. One of the trends in the upper school seems to be having non-teacher-led discussions. We saw that in Kate's wonderful presentation at the lower school meeting. And I'm interested in hearing, Jennifer, what teachers do when they're sitting back and you've got a student discussion going on. How does that work with the introverts who are more than likely wanting to pull back and not jump in?
Well, if you remember when Kate did this discussion for home and school, and she showed a video for this, some of you may not have been there, but she showed a video of her class, and she did a student-led discussion for the bulk of the class. And what she'd done to help the introverts is she had prepped them the night before, or the last class, where she had given them an article researching the Shakespearean play, and it talked about different dynamics, and so the kids had been able to read the article, they've been able to underline passages, make notes, and so that helped the kids who were on the quieter side to be prepared for that discussion. So they all had some ideas going into that debate of what they wanted to say. And what Kate did in a really masterful way, I thought, when I watched the class, is that, and she talked a little bit about this, she took about 6 pages of notes during that discussion. And every once in a while, when she thought the group needed a little bit of direction, she would ask a question or make a comment and help the group move. So it's actually, I think, what I loved about it as somebody who's been in many discussions, and I would label myself on the more introverted side, is that it felt as if everybody had a genuine opportunity to contribute, and that the teacher was really listening to them, and that the students were really listening to each other. And so it never felt, and there was a murmur when Katie talked about this earlier, that there was some person dominating. It never felt like there was that kid that was just putting their voice out because they just wanted to put their voice out. I thought Kate And a lot of our teachers do that incredibly well.
One of the things she did that was so dreadful in that, is she had told the students when they made their point, they had to find a passage to support it, which is so much better in general for the introverts than the extroverts. Because the extroverts just tend to throw out their idea, and then they say, well, where'd you get that idea from? And they haven't thought about it. So the introverts were able to have those things. And in addition, it was a safety anchor, which then means, okay, I've got this quote. This isn't my words. I can use this quote to support my point. And in watching the class, which was masterful, and then I went and visited her class, and she did one, and I was just blown away, but she explained that she trained them so that when I was speaking, no one interrupted me. When I did, then Jennifer spoke. And so the extrovert wasn't jumping in all the time in the last 7 words of the sentence, which I've been known to do to people. And they had to learn, which wasn't a bad skill for the extroverts to learn, to wait until people finished their thoughts, because that was the rule. And the kids followed the rule. If you hold the kids up to a high standard, they'll reach the standard. And she set the standard and they reached the standard. And she made them find a place in the book to support their position, which was good for everybody.
The one other strategy for that same question, and I think this fits to the introvert, which is the person who spends a little longer time on the problem, on the question, like Einstein, is you also can say within a discussion, you can also ask a good question. And what often the term is a genuine question, which is a question that I don't already know the answer to. So that as a ponderer, you can be that person who says, I really truly wonder why this. And that's as good as equal a contribution as having some great answer to something, is knowing how to ask a good question.
Right, maybe it's just semantics. We seem to be using participation and contribution interchangeably. I like the word contribution so much better because it does reflect on really putting something of value in there as opposed to just being active. And I think sometimes, you don't know if the child is just sitting there daydreaming or if they're really listening, which is such a great way to contribute. But if they then ask the good question, then they're really listening.
And I think that points out the cultural bias that's so strong that even as we're here talking about it, we fall back and use the old word of participation versus contribution, and I'm using the word productivity.
Productivity as far
Because
as...
we're trying to get away from that word participation, and yet, look what happens. It's, we're still a culture to the word. So thank you, that's a great point.
That's a great point. I wanted to bring up this, I wouldn't know about this example or this man were it not for Susan Cain talking about him, but this is somebody who's using all of these skills we're talking about in a real office. So this is a picture of Douglas Conant, and he was the CEO prior. His tenure just ended recently for Campbell's Soup. He took over the company when they were failing miserably, and it's one of the greatest business transformations, according to Forbes, kind of turnarounds, I should say, of all time. And he is an incredibly quiet man. And the way that he led Campbell's Soup in this transition is very different than how you would associate a leader, but very effective. So he, what that entailed is he had to own his own style. He knew he was an introvert. He didn't try to be someone different. So upon arriving, he said, look, this is kind of who I am and how I work. When I come in the mornings, I'm not gonna chit chat on my way in. I never really stop for coffee. My focus really when I get in is I just need to go right into my office and hunker down for a few hours. It's not it's not a slight. I'm certainly, not trying to send a message of exclusion, but this is really what I need. He said, I'm going to do away with these giant meetings that we've been having. I don't do very well in those, and it's hard for me to follow them. I'm okay if you do large meetings with your individual staff that you're under, and I support your way of leading. But for me, I'd like to have smaller meetings just with you as senior leaders. We're not going to make decisions at these meetings. We're going to have a follow-up meeting for the decision, kind of knowing that he would need to take in all of that information. He also, what he was known for, this is him writing a letter, is he wrote handwritten letters to staff. He would write about 10 to 15 a day. small letters of what he observed to be strength of his colleagues and coworkers. He did that for everybody at every level, from those who were on the housekeeping staff to senior leadership. He wrote, in fact, they said at the end of his tenure there was something like 8,000 letters written. So he observed and showed his appreciation in that way, but it was not a public, face-to-face sort of interaction. And so it's important that I mention this because as an introvert, if you are one or if your child is one, it becomes really necessary for you to own that. And I think that because of the bias in our culture that there is something flawed or second class about introversion, it becomes very hard for an introvert to proudly say, this is who I am and this is how I work best. And I know it's going to be effective because, I really understand myself. And that's really hard to say. And so this is a great example of somebody that was able to do that and led successfully. Because when an introvert isn't able to do that, many of their actions and behaviors can be misinterpreted by more extroverted people. It can be seen as cold, aloof, why isn't he interacting? Why isn't he around, participating? And yet, if you own what your style is and then you're able to show it differently in written letters, then everybody understood and he was beloved within that company. I know parents probably have more questions. It's not just about the introverts, it's true. Extroverts have a challenge as well. Half of us are extroverts, half the other way around. And extroverts can often make the mistake of overusing their own voice. Sheryl Sandberg actually hired a coach to help her speak less in meetings. The coach would go along with her and really help her find that restraint because she recognized her need to do that, much like that example of you could have a lower grade for dominating or contributing too loudly at the expense of the class discussion. So it's really important for extroverts to recognize the value of pairing themselves with thoughtful, contemplative, introverted types, that is an effective model, and that if you're looking at your business, your office, even your friendships, and you're not noticing that you have that part represented, you'd be wise to really begin to build that other side, to have that balanced duality, and really to seek that counsel in a way that works for the introvert, not at a loud meeting. Paul, what do you think? But rather, in a way that's going to work for that introvert to share his or her point of view. There's one piece that, I'm sorry Ryan's not here because it was Ryan Hoagland that cued me to this, that I think it's a really important final piece to share, and I think teachers can probably contribute to this, that there is a point in which introversion becomes, I say avoidance, I think what I really mean is isolation, and an isolation to a degree that's unhealthy. And again, I think that comes from really that bias, introverts not being able to feel safe totally to be themselves. They can get to a point where they are too far away from the world. Oftentimes it's the most common example is that introverts find refuge behind a screen, but it also can be in solo pursuits, art, music, which again can be really healthy and productive if you're developing a website for clean air, in your room for hours. That's really healthy if you're playing your instrument for hours on end, also really healthy, but it's very necessary for those introverts to be able to form, it can be a small safe community, but find a haven where they can share those ideas and be able to have a meaningful connection with others. Introverts need those too. And if you do have a child that has gone too far to where you're concerned about isolation, I think it's a call to you to think about how can you help your child build a safe space. Don't force them to join lacrosse, not that you would, but let's not overcompensate here, but think, okay, how can I help find one or two like-minded kids that they could pair up with. Maybe it's once a week to kind of talk about web design and really get together and collaborate. That's how Steve Jobs formed Apple. It's solo work for weeks on end, and then they'd meet in this garage and they'd all show their ideas and their tinkering, and then, you know, over time Apple was born. So if your child is too far, I think you could certainly talk to many of these, you know, wise leaders you have at the school that maybe could help. They could perhaps help you identify other children that may have a similar interest, and you can gently build that. You can certainly try to look for clubs or small groups within the community that speak to that interest. You know, honor the interest, honor that, and that need to have part of it, a large part of it, be a solo experience. But if it's too far and your child is either going into shyness or feeling of being judged, or avoidance to where it's painful, that's a time that you need to help them, draw them out in a safe way. So and all of us grew up in this world where the extrovert ideal was overvalued. And we may feel like that's what we need to do for a child to succeed, is to push them to be successful, push them into something, because if not, there's a disadvantage that they will seek. But I hope that you can see, you know, with the example of Douglas Conant and J.K. Rowling and many of these powerful people in our community, even Jennifer Blake, who outed herself as an introvert here today, you know, that you can have a successful and meaningful life with the tools, the strengths that you do have. So it's important for you as a parent to if you do have an introverted child, to honor that and to not push them to conform to something that you feel is more socially appropriate in this world we live in. So so that's my final point. But we have plenty of people here to contribute. A couple of great quotes. The secret to life is to put yourself in the right lighting. For some, it's a Broadway spotlight. For others, a lamplit desk. Both of those lights a person can shine in a way that's powerful for the world. And finally, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and we should use them proportionally. So thank you all. Please use myself if you'd like to ask about the research, and any of the people here from the school. Ask questions or any comments. We'd love to have those. But thank you.
Are you going to do a Q&A or no?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, here we are. Yes.
One question, or not really a question, a comment that I have. Introverts as well as extroverts learn through literature and reading fiction. And it seems to me as though there is a lot of books for the middle grade and YA audience that really is plugging the introvert, Perks of a Wallflower and Eleanor and Park, and there is quite a push now for authors to write to the introverted market, and I think kids see that and they're beginning to recognize that, you know, I hate to put the word value on it, but that there's a place for them in the world. So
I think that's a great point. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with literature, particularly in, you know, middle school. Do you notice the same, that trend?
Yeah, well, yes and no. I mean, I think we intentionally, there's still a lot of, you know, Harry Potter is not an introvert by nature, you know. I mean, there's still the big drama saga kind of thing that a lot of kids still leap for, but I think we also are intentionally picking a lot in our program and recommending to kids through our library programs, and kids are, and authors are responding to that because they want to write the story of not just the a prototypical protagonist kind of thing, that's the hero that saves, and recognizing even in our, I go back to our 6th grade again, the hero's journey, that isn't always the most extroverted person. I mean, sorry to use a blockbuster, but Katniss Everdeen is an introvert, you know, and that is a powerful message to introverts, particularly introverted girls, that you know how terrified she was to actually start a revolution.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yes.
Oh, my question is, you know, as I read the book and I, you know, thinking about my own family and my child, I'm thinking, oh yeah, I have an introvert with a touch of shy. So, but how do you know, is it appropriate, like you're saying, if you're seeing responses that say, hey, would really like her to participate more, really like her to participate more, to go to the teacher and say, hey, how about trying the question at night? And coming back and allowing them to have the opportunity to come in and shine for a second because they're intimidated to speak out in front of a huge room. And I know that's the case. And how do you know if it's one or the other, or maybe it's a little of both because it's middle school, which is hard anyway? I mean, but is it appropriate to have that conversation at parent-teacher conferences, which are coming up? And just say, hey, you know what, I think if you try, these are some really great ideas. If you tried this and this, and you'd see maybe a different kid the next day, you know? And
I think that teachers here are very open, especially when a parent comes in not on the attack, but it comes in with the idea of, okay, how can we work together to help my child? I'm hearing from you, you want to participate more. When I see as a very shy or introverted child, how can we gain contribution from this child as opposed to participation in your class together and brainstorm? Bring up the book. Actually, when the book first came out, I gave it specifically to 2 teachers who I knew were struggling with kids who were introverted. And afterwards, they came to me and said, oh my gosh, you know, we may be talking about this, but even as wonderful as our faculty is, they're not all up to the same level at the same time. And so suggestions on how to help your child can help. For example, I gave a teacher a suggestion the other day, which isn't exactly this, but similar. So the kid took his iPad home in 5th grade. It's not supposed to do normally over the weekend, because he said, I want to do this and catch up on my work on Monday. Well, he forgot. Monday comes, teacher says, do you have it done? No. The teacher out of frustration said, well, I'm sorry you chose not to do that. So I called the teacher out because I was in the class that day, and I said, this child did not choose not to do this. This wasn't an active decision or a passive decision. He's just spacey. He's a 5th grade boy, you know, and, you know, he took the iPad home with all good intentions and completely forgot about it. So what you need to do is don't make a comment like that which just crushes the kid. You chose not to do this. The kid loves the teacher, and now it's crushed. Say to the child, you know, maybe we need to make a plan when you take something home. And in parent-teacher conference, talk to the parent and say, when your child takes the iPad home to catch up on their work, I will email you, and you need to set a time with that child. For example, let's say this coming up. Okay, when are you going to do this weekend? If you have, and it's not just boys, but if you have a boy, they're likely to say, oh, I'll do it Sunday. And I even think about it because it's Saturday and then I have to do it Sunday and I don't have to worry about it. So, okay, when's Sunday? Well, 3 o'clock. Well, you know, are you going to want to watch the pre-Super Bowl game? Oh, yeah, probably. Well, let's pick 2 o'clock. Okay, so we're going to put 2 o'clock. You're going to put it on your iPhone or my iPhone, and at 2 o'clock, you'll do it Sunday. And there's no nagging. At 2 o'clock to do it. And the parent loved it, the teacher loved it, the kid loved it. Because, and it's becoming the same thing with introversion in terms of, okay, how can I get participation from this child, which is authentic, helps the student learn, helps the student feel good about it. And for the extrovert, you need to learn to talk a little less. For the introvert, you need to maybe learn to participate a little more. So participation still is of some value in situations.
Well,
so
it's
yes,
connected to contribution. I mean, they're interlinked.
And speaking to your point too about shyness, there's going to be an element of shyness that all of us are going to have in certain circumstances, because that sense of a fear of being judged, or that's human nature. So I think that the trick is to figure out how often that's happening. If there's pockets of shyness with your child at school in certain circumstances, but then the child can have safety and connection among his or her small group where she can be authentic and herself, you know, a good bit of the time, then I probably wouldn't be too concerned about it. It's just kind of how far that painful shyness goes, and does it infiltrate all aspects of their life, and certainly if it's getting in the way of their, you know, their ability to do their, you know, academic work in the way they need to, or, you know, something like that, that's fine. But I mean, middle school, right, it's almost just inherent that they're going to have a decent bit of that. Yeah.
Do you find that children who are introverted make different observations?
Oh, yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. Do you, I mean, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question. Do you find that introverts make different observations?
So
Absolutely. Yes.
It's kind of like the curve. Sometimes we'll say boys or girls, but the reality is it's not all boys or all girls. It's not all extroverts or all introverts. But you'll say introverts more often will do this. So yes, they'll more often. That doesn't mean solely it's occurred, but yes, absolutely.
There's a great example in the book where Susan Cain talks about meetings, right? And in meetings, you'll find that extroverts make a lot of comments, they're very active in the discussion. But if you don't have introverts as a part of that meeting and observing facial expressions and who's pushing their chair away and who's maybe disengaged, and then the introvert comes back and sort of says, actually, I think the next time we should do this. You need both in order to make good decisions and in order for a group to really gel. So I think that that happens in our classrooms all the time, where sometimes a student who doesn't speak as much is actually paying more attention to the emotions in the room and is able then to circle back maybe individually with another student and say, it looked like you weren't happy about that or you didn't get your point in, and I think that it's really important for those students to be there.
In her book and in some other books, they point out during the Wall Street problem, as they filtered all the introverts out of those meetings, there was no introverts in those meetings to step back and say, maybe we're taking too much risk, because they all got, so she points out that had there been introverted voices, had Alice's voice in there, perhaps some of those risks might have been avoided. So, yes, they would observe
The
the
rules
meeting.
of engagement are different.
Yeah. Should we do one last question? I know some of you have to.
Well, in the book, there's a chapter about Harvard Business School and the demand, the super extrovert environment there. And I think of our, kind of what we value here, college prep program, really preparing kids for success and, and getting into colleges, and there's, I'm just wondering where we're going with all of this and how it's affecting, if we're valuing introverts more, aren't we still gonna have those like dog eat dog, you jump in or you're gonna be, lost in the world, but people applying and valuing those high-level university and business situations where it's not balanced, and it might not be balanced ever there, or not at least for a long time. So what are we doing with all of that in terms of our kids and in the kind of the college admissions process and all of that?
It's as though if we do it really well here, that's all fine and good, but when they go to college, if that value is not represented, which clearly it's not, you're kind of wondering then what?
What are we? How do we encourage our kids to go from here to where the big
Well,
world?
I know you probably have a comment too. I was going to say I think it comes back to also this idea of I just helped I have a senior at the University of Utah, a girl I work with in my practice, who actually ended up dropping out last year in her senior seminar because she was getting docked so significantly for this lack of participation in this 12-person class. And she's back, which is great, but our strategy really in her going back is to say, to own this time, to talk to the teacher beforehand, to say, I really struggled, it's a new teacher this time, but I really struggled when I did this class last time, and these were the reasons, and I need to figure out a way that I can show my participation, but that's true to myself. So she's going in and owning it this time, and saying, can we work together, kind of what you were mentioning in the last example with parents going to teachers, can we work together to think about ways that I can show my participation in this class that may not necessarily be through the large class discussion that you format, on the Thursday night class. And so I'm hopeful, I can't guarantee that she's going to be receptive, but I'm hopeful that if more introverts can speak up and own who they are and what their style is at the beginning and be able to be open to a new path, that perhaps some of these, dog-eat-dog kinds of practices on the college level will also begin to change as more professors see that children or teens, adults are owning that part of
So
themselves.
interesting, Stanford came out with a book about this book big a year and a half ago about how they want to transform the education they offer. And the dean responsible for it talked to a group of heads, JRPO heads, or the Malone School heads, a year and a half ago, and we said, a year ago, and said, how well is this going? And here is this powerful dean of Stanford said, not very well. And we're all going, said, you have to recognize the faculty here are pretty powerful. And though we recognize there's some changes we want to make here, we're going to have resistors and we're going to have early adopters. So we are moving the school in this direction, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. Some of the things in this report are one of the things we're talking about. More collaborative work, more opportunities for an individual. Their school of design, which is now considered the best in the world, allows for a lot of individual creativity, a lot of small group work, a lot of different ways to authentically assess what you're doing. So you see these colleges starting to recognize these things and wanting to incorporate them. And it's going to take time. Some colleges are going to be ahead of others. If I had a very introverted kid who wanted to go to business school and asked me where should I go, I would say don't go to Harvard. Let's say they had all the choices because they had great grades. I'd actually say go to the University of Utah over Harvard. University of Utah is on the cutting edge of doing some of the stuff in the makerspace they've got downtown. We've got our kids working with them. They allow for more alternatives than Harvard's, and I think Stanford too. So you now look at the school and say, what school might be best, or is trying at least, to incorporate some of this, which Stanford is trying to do, for example, and the University of Utah Business School is clearly trying to do. Really impressive some of the things they're doing right now.
The only other thing I would add is that I think in a place like Rowland Hall, where you have such great relationships between students and teachers, is that in our high school, our students are getting really comfortable talking to adults. They are really comfortable reaching out and saying, you know, this is working, this isn't working. And so that skill helps them when they go to college, because the colleges that come to Rowland Hall, that come to the independent schools say, like, we want your kids because they know how to go to office hours. They know how to create that partnership with our teachers. And so I think that alone is going to help them as they move forward.
Well, that was actually something I was just wanting to comment on. I mean, like your student and like these children in high school that are comfortable talking to their professors. And I know my daughter learned it very well here. But I'd like to see, you know, these kids learning how to be their own advocates. And maybe a talk about this particularly to the children who might consider themselves an introvert, teaching them how to become their own advocate a little more.
Well, I can tell you, we do a lot of that one-on-one too. That a student may come to Ryan or me and say, I'm having this concern, or I'm afraid to talk with this teacher. And so we say, okay, let's model what that conversation is going to look like. Let's practice it. Or let me come with you the first time, and I'll sit in the meeting and we'll sort of make this go well, but then next time it's up to you. So we know one of the nice things about having such a small community is that we know the kids who are the extroverts, we know the kids who are introverts, and we're able to really sort of shepherd them along and talk about it. And one of the huge things we find ourselves trying to do with high school kids is to turn them into self-advocates before they leave the doors. And so we start in 9th grade where it's very structured and very much about, we're here, we're holding your hand, and then as we get to junior and senior year, there are moments where you're really going to have to deal with that on your own. So it's a conscious kind of step-by-step process before they leave.
It'd be interesting if they got the same definitions we did at the beginning and were able to sit there and reflect on themselves quietly, in a group maybe, but just go, where do I fall in this?
Yeah.
Maybe they don't know that they might be an introvert,
Yeah.
and need that. I don't know.
Exactly.
No, it's a great point.
Thanks, you guys. That was a really interesting, great discussion, and really fun to hear how it's being applied here at the school. It's really exciting and encouraging.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you, Katie.